There's a saying that goes, everybody wants to save the world, but nobody wants to do the dishes. And it's a great little phrase, and it's one that you could modify for Christians. You could say, everybody wants to know God's will for their life, but nobody wants to conform their lives to God's will. And that's a perennial problem. I mean, if you listen to Deuteronomy 29:29, it says this, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law. So there's a distinction here between God's secret and revealed will that anchors our understanding of the way that he works in our lives. You know, we all want him to show us the easiest path from point A to point B, or to tell us exactly who to marry, where to move, what job to take, how to advance our career, so on and so forth. But in Deuteronomy 29, God says that there's his secret will, his secret providence, his plan for how things unfold, and it's a secret. So he doesn't want us spending all of our time trying to discern something he has not designed for us to know. Rather, he says, the things that I have revealed, his prescriptive will, his moral commands, the things that are explicit within Scripture, those are the things that we ought to dedicate our time to obeying, studying, meditating on, and thinking about. God is more concerned about the kind of people that we become. He wants us to become the kind of people who make wise decisions, who faithfully obey him through all the ups and downs of his secret providence. How do we respond to the events in our life? That's what God is very concerned about. And Ruth and Boaz embody this kind of faithfulness by acting in courageous and righteous ways despite not knowing the ins and outs of God's secret plan. They know that he's at work, but they don't know every detail. And that's okay, because both of these characters act and even risk because their character is righteous, their motives are pure, and they're walking forward doing the next right thing. And as a result, they are wrapped up within God's great narrative, a story that surpasses anything that they could ask or think. This is Understanding Ruth. Ruth is a story of hesed, something we mentioned in the first episode, which is faithful love that goes beyond obligation. It's this extravagant generosity. And it is not only manifested in the life of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz, but it's ultimately demonstrated in God himself, God's covenant faithfulness, God's faithfulness to his own people, the promises that he, out of his own free will, binds himself to by grace. In chapter 1, we meet Naomi and her husband Elimelech as they sojourn into Moab, escaping a famine in the land of Bethlehem. And tragedy strikes, and Naomi loses not only her husband Elimelech, but her two sons, who have also left two widowed Moabites, Ruth and Orpah. These are Moabite women that they married. Naomi hears that God has actually restored bread to Bethlehem, and that provides the opportunity for her to return home. But it puts her at a crossroads because she doesn't want to take away the life of Orpah and Ruth. They don't have anything to gain from staying with her. And so Orpah, understandably, decides to just go back home. Maybe she can raise her own family and put all this behind her. But Ruth does something different. She pledges her fidelity, her faithfulness, her hesed to Naomi. She says, your God will be my God, your people my people. I will go to your land, and that will be my new home. And this radical act of faith keys us into the kind of faith that God desires that his own people would have. And so as they head back home, Naomi, in her bitterness and her grief, is accompanied by Ruth. And Ruth becomes this key player in the redemption of Naomi's story, from emptiness to fullness, from sorrow to joy. And in Ruth chapter 2, we see the first concrete step toward the fulfillment of this hope, the coming reversal of her bitterness back into joy. This chapter breaks down into three scenes. First, Ruth happens upon the field of Boaz in verses 1 to 3. Second, Boaz shows generosity to Ruth, verses 4 to 17. And finally, Naomi reveals Boaz as the kinsman redeemer, verses 18 to 23. Let's look at that first scene. Ruth happens upon the field of Boaz in verses 1 to 3. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. So chapter 2 begins abruptly with a note about Boaz's familial relation to Naomi's deceased husband, Elimelech. The author describes Boaz as a worthy man, not only in social status and reputation, but more importantly, in character and righteousness. And his blood relation to Elimelech qualifies him as a kinsman redeemer, who through a practice called levirate marriage may marry the widow of a deceased relative in order to bear children for him and preserve the family line. Very important in the ancient Near East. Now, good stories foreshadow future events as a way of drawing the attention of the audience by raising the drama and the suspense. And so the mention of Boaz, this seemingly throwaway line about his blood relation, is actually cueing in the audience and building this anticipation for his eventual encounter with Ruth that's going to bring about the solution to Naomi's sorrow. On the level of the characters, however, neither Ruth nor Naomi perceive the purposes of God in their actions. Ruth decides to glean grain from the fields out of her hesed, out of her faithfulness to Naomi, her love. That's what motivates her to act. And this requires a great deal of courage and faith. She's a foreign widow with no rights or standing. She depends entirely upon the favor of others and ultimately on God to bless her plans. She also risks her life in seeking favor. You know, in the Old Testament law, it's commanded that landowners allow foreigners, widows, and orphans to glean from their fields, meaning that they walk behind the harvesters and collect leftover grain for provision. Now, some commentators suspect that Israel, particularly in the time of the judges, neglected this command. And we can even see later on the prophets are constantly decrying the injustice of depriving the rights of the poor and the sojourner and the widow and the orphan. And some commentators suspect that the fact that Ruth needs to seek favor in order to find provision shows the corrupt nature of the times, and that she is completely at the mercy of Israelite kindness and compassion. Whatever the case may be, Ruth's vulnerable status accentuates her faith and her humility. She steps out with a humble and gentle posture, seeking to serve her grieving mother-in-law. And in doing so, in exercising this above and beyond self-sacrifice, she finds herself wrapped up in God's story. She happens, quote unquote, upon a field that belongs to Boaz. The very person that we saw at the beginning of this chapter is the faint glimmer of hope for Naomi's story. Let's look at this next scene. Boaz shows generosity to Ruth, verses 4 to 16. "And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered, 'The Lord bless you.' Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?' And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, 'She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest.' Then Boaz said to Ruth, 'Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field, or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn.' Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, 'Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?' But Boaz answered her, 'All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied. And she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." This next section begins with a note of drama. Behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And so this happenstance of Ruth ending up in Boaz's field, and then the coincidence that Boaz appears right at that moment underscores God's sovereignty over all things. It's a surprise to the characters, but not to God. And as the audience, we get to see that unfold before our eyes. We're placed in a privileged position in that respect. Now in chapter 2, dialogue rather than exposition carries the narrative, unlike chapter 1, where it's very focused on their actions and their movements. Specifically, the two pieces of dialogue at the heart of this passage. A first dialogue between Boaz and his workers, and then a second dialogue between Boaz and Ruth. The first dialogue reveals the hesed faithfulness of Ruth. Right? She gleans and gathers with remarkable work ethic. I mean, she's laboring from early morning with little rest. And she catches the eye of Boaz, who has no background knowledge of her. He says, "Whose young woman is this?" He doesn't know if she's married, if she's a daughter. And in response, the servant relays Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi, telling about how she left her homeland and is serving her widowed mother-in-law. And that leads to the second dialogue. In the second dialogue, Boaz reflects the hesed of God. He kind of stands in the place of God, manifesting his faithfulness and generosity by extending to Ruth familial protection, provision, and hospitality. He welcomes the stranger in. He protects her by telling the young men not to harass her. And then he actually provides for her by saying, you can actually glean in the most privileged parts of the field. And he also extends hospitality. He says, you can drink from the same well as my workers. And at the end, he actually shares a meal with her. Come sit with me. She gets to sit at the family table. Now, the dialogue between Ruth and Boaz is very key in understanding the point of this story. From a worldly perspective, Ruth lacks all the social standing and background and heritage that you would want for a suitable wife, especially for a man of the stature of Boaz. But Boaz counts her as worthy, not because of all these societal trappings, but because of her faithfulness. He sees worthiness in her character. He hears her story. And the language is reminiscent again of Abraham's story. Boaz sees the worth of her faith as a faith that reflects that of the father of Israel, Abraham. She, like Abraham, left father and mother to go to a foreign land out of obedience to God. And so she also will receive a reward from the God of Israel, the God of Abraham. Ruth recognizes that as a foreigner, as a widow, in her position of vulnerability, she is entirely dependent upon the benevolence of others. And that becomes the soil out of which her faith grows. That dependence is exactly what God is looking for. That's what always marks out God's people. And Boaz manifests the faithfulness of God who responds to our need with protection, provision, and hospitality. He fellowships with us. He wants to unite with us. And so the narrative challenges the way that we gauge worth, which reveals whether we properly understand what actually matters to God, how God actually views the world. Our eyes might gravitate toward the wealthy and powerful, but his eyes look upon the humble and contrite. And it's because Boaz is a worthy man that he recognizes her worthiness. Now, we come to the conclusion of this second chapter in this last little section that shows Naomi revealing Boaz as kinsman redeemer. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides," he said to me, "you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest." And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. God blesses Ruth's labor with an abundant harvest of barley, which she uses to feed Naomi. We can pick up on the irony. Ruth comes back home from working the fields, and she knows that she worked with Boaz, but doesn't know the significance of Boaz. Naomi knows Boaz's significance, but she doesn't realize that Ruth has worked with him. And so you can see their narratives come together, and there's that anticipation, that drama when it's revealed, oh my gosh, God is answering our prayers right before our eyes. This is the opportunity. How are we going to find this relative? Well, you just happened upon the very field that belongs to him. And Naomi seems to burst back to life. Up until this point, she's consumed with her grief and her sorrow. And she takes this very passive role. But there's almost a resurrection in her. She blesses God that through the kindness of Boaz, the dead have not been forsaken, and she who is living has not been forsaken. Her husband's memory will live on. There will be a future for her family, possibly through Boaz. And so God's hesed, his faithfulness, appears in the most unexpected way. But this hope gets deferred. It says that the two women essentially remained in the same state until the end of the barley and wheat harvests. That's a period of 7 weeks. That's 7 weeks of going to the fields with no visible progress with Boaz after that initial burst of hope. The story is not yet over. They received this initial provision of bread, but they need to keep being faithful because God is still working more redemption, more filling that they are not yet privy to. And so Ruth continues to work and labor. Part of submitting to God's will is submitting to his timing. And our call is not to grow despondent, but by faith continue submitting our will to God by obedience, responding rightly to his gracious providence day by day, knowing that our labor is not in vain. And so this isn't some story where it just magically all comes at once, but rather the waiting actually provides a time for Ruth's character and faithfulness to manifest more fully. And that is the essence of hope, right? Hope is what drives us forward into an unknown future, knowing that God is writing the story, even if we don't know all the details. And that is what keeps us anchored to day by day, obey him and trust him, knowing that all of these tangled webs of narratives and loose ends will find their final resolution. God is the author who is always at work, and he invites us by faith into that unfolding narrative to play our part. And that's the invitation to the audience of Ruth, to consider themselves within this story and consider what it would mean for them to trust in the faithfulness of God and to embody it in their lives.